In the early months of 1962, the Aurora space program would debut its greatest rocket yet, the Kuruk-3 Heavy, capable of lifting 5 tons into low Earth orbit. This rocket would carry the final satellites of the NAVCOM contracts. This is Globestar 2 through 4, ready to enter its network in low Earth orbit. These satellites will be sent off back to the NAVCOM Corporation once they have reached orbit, but this rocket is a tech demonstrator for a vehicle that will be able to send probes, relays, and more into space. Ideally, this vehicle will be used for interplanetary travel in the coming years. This contract for the final 3 satellites of the NAVCOM Corporation will round out the United States government's obligation and the Aurora Space Program's obligation to the NAVCOM Corporation, as was promised so many years ago at this point. After this contract is completed, we will be able to finally focus on the things that matter most: getting crew into orbit, getting probes in orbit around the moon, and sending probes beyond into deep space. Up on top of that pusher stage, you can see 3 advanced satellite buses waiting to enter into their final orbit, which will be approximately 65,000 meters above, 65,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. These satellites will be in one of the highest circular orbits ever done, and unfortunately they will not be able to be used by the Aurora space program for our own communications. These are communication satellites that will work for the Earth, work for the military, and work for the NAVCOM Corporation and their means. Other space programs, if they get their feet off the ground, may follow suit, but for now the Aurora space program is the only program with the capability to launch such probes. In the meantime, this would be a great time to talk about some administrative things. First, this year we will not be able to put crew in orbit. It is really unfortunate. We will attempt to set an altitude record later on this year. However, the funding available and the research that has been done does not allow us to have a crew member in orbit until at the earliest 1964. Currently, we have plans to do it as soon as possible, but a suborbital launch may be only possible within 1963, and a crewed launch in early 1964. Now you can see we are deploying those satellites into their final orbits. The little Pioneer adjustment motor on the bottom is going to send them off away from the spacecraft, where their orbits can then be adjusted by the NAVCOM Corporation. Each satellite fully deploying there, as you can see, and I'm renaming them so that way they are in our database stored as the proper satellites. Of course, they are much more advanced than the satellites that we are currently producing, though I suppose a corporation dedicated to the construction of satellites for their own purposes would have a better time actually creating those satellites than we would, since our program is more devoted towards the construction of rockets at this point. You can see we did attempt to bring the vehicle out of orbit. However, the satellites, I guess I must have gotten my footage out of order here, but here we'll watch the deployment once again of the satellites. A little unfortunate, I guess, that happened, but I guess you'll get the picture. You'll get twice as much information. You'll get to see the satellites deploy twice. Of course, they were successful, and going forward, I think we're going to try and focus more on satellite construction. We want to make sure that we are minimizing the weight of our probes. That's something that I didn't really focus on up until this point, and a lot of my boosters and a lot of my probes still use quite outdated avionics, stuff that really was for the mid 50s, maybe even late 50s, but now we are in the 60s and we really should have some better avionics. Unfortunately, we focused a little heavily on engines. Now you're going to see a bit of science stuff coming up, as we got a few science points from the satellites that are currently in orbit collecting data. Yeah, back, and we are picking up a few new tabs. We've got the capsules coming in, and we are going to pick up a few other things like the solid rocket motors and potentially even engines. If I remember correctly, here we are checking them out. I wanted to pick up some solar panels. I do know that I picked up the solar panels. We've got plenty of science really for all of this. It's something that we've been working on. We've been trying to get more satellites up in orbit that can produce more scientific data for us that we can then spend on researching our new parts that the engineers can use. Unfortunately, that was the first launch and the only launch of the first half of the year, and now that we're stuck with a long wait period in between our launches, I had to focus a little bit on some other stuff like science, since our funding is just so abysmal, and we're trying to get some of our buildings and complexes upgraded so that way our astronauts like Gwen can be trained up for orbital maneuvers. And here we are with the measly 1I on a Kuruk 3416A. Let's go down that new name that we have. The Meatsli is a lunar goddess for the Aztecs, and I thought it fitting to name our early lunar probes after the Meatsli. If I pronounce that correctly or pronounce it wrong, I apologize. I'm trying to pronounce as best as I can. But that probe is named after that goddess, and it has some pretty cool connotations. I would like to use as much Native American and South American names as possible in this series, which is where like the Kuruk, which means the bear, stuff derives from. And currently this is the latest name in that series. As you can see, before we were launching Globe Stars, which kind of an American name. It's because it was created by a corporation. It's not created by the Aurora space program, which tries to derive our names as much from Native American folklore and culture. As for the booster, the Kuruk 3416A, I'm trying to create a little bit of a more standardized naming program for my boosters going forward. So the Kuruk 3, we all know what that is. It's the standard base Kuruk 3. We could call it also the Kuruk 400A. This means that it uses first generation engines, which is what the A stands for. It means it's the first generation of that booster with the current configuration. The 4 stands for a 4-meter tall fairing, or a 4-meter. Yeah, I think it should be a 4-meter tall fairing. I'm not entirely sure about that. That seems a little off to me, but I can't remember exactly. So we've got the 4, which is supposed to stand for the fairing. Then we've got the 1, which means there's a single upper stage engine, which is that LR91A. And then we've got 6, which stands for 6 strap-on boosters. In the event that we update any of those features, like the main engines, the LR89s, we update them to a newer variant, or we add new boosters for the strap-ons, then they would be changed to a Kuruk 3416B. And then same thing for the Kuruk 3, which is technically a Kuruk 400A. It would go to a B. I'm trying to update that naming convention just that way I know all the features of a booster when I'm picking it out in the sub-assemblies in the VAB. Pretty simple. I am very happy with that naming convention, and I think I want to use it as much as possible going forward. Here you can see that our tiny Meatsley probe has separated the Meatsley 1i. It is designed as an impactor probe, and that is what this probe will be doing. We released it on the normal vector, so that way it didn't adjust its orbit when we activated that decoupler. There is a little bit of force in the decoupler, but I put it down to the minimum possible, so that way the stage separates from the probe, but it doesn't change the orbit too much. And here you can see we are approaching the moon with our little probe that could. And it's coming in for its final approach and impact. And the moon is quite a beautiful sight in Realism Overhaul. A beautiful sight indeed. This is really the culmination of Satish Dhawan's work. He wanted to send these probes to the moon with our program. However, at the time, before he resigned, he was unable to convince the United States Congress to appropriate funding towards the program to do so. Even though the program is independent and theoretically private, Satish Dhawan still required the aid of Congress to be able to do any of those major programs. I'm sure Aurora Space Program on its own could fund perhaps the creation of a small low Earth orbit program, but for anything that is major like that, you're definitely going to need government funding. And here we have the Meatsley 2.0, and I'll explain a little bit about that. It is once again launched on top of a Kuruk 3416A. It's going to be a pretty standard heavy lift booster going forward. Maybe we'll launch a few more Meatsleys on board before we get some upgrades in there. And as for the Meatsley 2.0, we are going to start designating our satellites that go around foreign bodies with specific things. So like, for example, the Meatsley 2.0, what does the O stand for? It stands for orbiter. The Meatsley 1i, what does the I stand for? It stands for impactor. And we're going to do a similar thing for landers. We're going to do LL or HL. So we have, if we had a Meatsley, let's say like a Meatsley 4L, LL, that would be a light lander. As for an HL, that's a heavy lander. And I think the differentiation between a light lander and a heavy lander is going to be, one is designed with the strict purpose of keeping the mass minimal. So we're going to try and minimize mass at any cost. And a heavy lander is going to be one that could do things like deploy rovers. It can deploy little science experiments on the surface and do whatever it needs to do really for its mission. Of course, that won't always be the case. We won't always have specific probes within those specific boundaries. We won't always have a perfect light lander or a perfect heavy lander. However, I'm going to try and keep it within those two naming conventions, so that way when we're scrolling through our save file, I guess you won't be scrolling too much through the save file, but I will be, and I'm starting to get a lot of crafts in my save file. I want to know exactly what the specific craft was for, because right now I have a lot of Tayan craft, and the Tayans, they all are just numbered, and I don't remember what I was using that craft for. And so when we go around foreign bodies, we have more of a specific mission, so it's better to add a little bit more information to those foreign body probes. As for the Tayans, I'm going to continue to keep them numbered just for the simplicity. I'm not going to change up the system too much. The Kuruks we've only changed up because I do a lot of maintenance to my sub-assembly folder for rocket boosters. Here you can see the Measley has reached orbit, and it is going around, I believe, looking for its next time to boost. It's waiting for the next launch. There we go. Oh, it has not reached orbit. Excuse me. I apologize for a little bit of the lacking careful nature. I tend to try and put a little bit more planning into my dialogue and things that I say in these videos. However, this video is really late. As I am speaking, it is now Friday. The video is to come out within around 10 hours from now, so I have to be a little quick with this. This probe is now reaching orbit aboard the LR-91 upper stage for the Kuruk 3416, and it is getting pushed quite well. I am quite happy with that. You can see here we separate ourselves with the AJ-10 upper stage, only using around 40 to 60 meters per second, I believe, of delta V for the AJ-10 upper stage, just to separate ourselves from the LR-91, since the LR-91 is now going to be able to drop back in and burn up as it comes back down from orbit. Now that we are in orbit, we are going to begin to use our AJ-10 to conduct maneuvers. You can see we do our first burn, and this burn is going to send us out towards the moon and beyond. Now this rocket is barely capable of putting this stage into orbit, and this stage is barely capable of sending the Measley 2.0 to the moon. It really is a stage designed for an impactor. Truly, I could probably put the stage on top of the Kuruk 3 Heavy, and I would have a bit of a better time. However, the Kuruk 3 Heavy just takes so much time and money to build. I wanted to get these orbiters going as soon as possible. And I suppose now would be a pretty good time to talk about the design of the Measley 2.0. The Measley 2.0 is the Measley 1i in every single way, has no solar panels, has maybe about 10 or so days of electric charge, and the only difference is going to be that instead of just sitting on top of the AJ-10 upper stage like the 1i did, the 2.0 is on top of a small Baby Sergeant rocket motor. This Baby Sergeant is going to be only used to slow it down once it gets to the moon, so that way it sticks to orbit. This is a bit of a cowardly tactic, maybe a bit of a backhanded way of getting into orbit, something that people maybe like NASA, I've seen a couple videos suggesting this back a few years. I think it was NASA. I'm not really sure. It's been maybe 3 years since that video came out, but someone suggested that this is the way that you get into early lunar orbit. And I'm not the Soviet Union. I don't have access to the same engines that they have, and I don't have the same level of technology that they have in terms of heavy lifters. And so we're using really a light launcher to send this probe that is very light to the moon, and it will barely enter orbit. And I'm a bit sad about that, but what can you do? It can't be helped. You have to use what you got in front of you. And I'm still trying to save funds because I would like to upgrade my astronaut complex and get working on orbital science. And here I am planning out to see how much fuel it would take to get into the orbit that I want. Unfortunately, this probe will be a bit of a failure. I won't be able to reach the orbit that I needed for the contract to be fulfilled. And I am unfortunately now going to have to put another Meetsley on top of a rocket. And I think the next one's going to be the 3.0. And I think I will be a little bit like the Soviet Union in the idea that I am going to send probes like the 3.0. I'm going to keep doing over and over again until I get it right. So, the Soviet Union would designate probes that failed Cosmos. For me, I'm going to just keep the name that they have originally, but I'm going to designate them debris, and I'm going to reuse the name until the probe is successful. Just kind of similar to how in the very early program I reused the TN5 a couple times. I believe it was the TN5, one of my very, very early probes that launched aboard the Ohote 600. And the TN5 name was reused quite often over the course, I think, of 3 attempts or 3 probes. So yeah. And that was a very simple way to get into orbit. I didn't have access to deep space avionics, so I had no way of adjusting my heading mid-course. So back when we were still in Earth's gravity, I went ahead and I spun up the craft in the direction that I would need to go, as if I were engaging and completing that node. And I spun it up and then I released it, so that way I could just go off and do its own thing. All I had to do was press the button on the probe to ignite the solid rocket motor, and as you can see, it was successful. We made it into orbit. Here I am getting a couple shots, probably one for the thumbnail of this video. We'll see. I still have to do that, and we've got a few hours left before this video hits YouTube. And once again, I would like to apologize, really. I know I typically want to try and do a more reasonable and more planned and scripted approach to videos, but if I was going to get this video out in time, I didn't have the extra time to spend on that, especially since I work early in the morning tomorrow. So I didn't even have the morning to work on it. But here I am getting a couple beautiful shots of the moon as we are spinning around, sort of like a top, it really looks like, but it's quite beautiful. I'm very happy to have reached the moon at this point. It is getting very close to our deadlines. By this year, and probably this time this year, if I remember correctly, the Americans were already in orbit. And last year should have been the year that I did my Mercury Redstone, more or less, launch. And I suppose it's a little embarrassing that I'm so far behind. But with any luck, we might be able to reach and land on the moon utilizing Gemini technology. We'll see. Who knows, really? I'm planning on it, but I want to definitely try and still beat the Americans in their real life to the moon, and I'm going to try my best. But that mission gave us quite a bit of science, our first science from the moon. We put on as many scientific instruments as possible to that probe, though we only had, about 7 days of electric charge once we actually reached the moon. A little bit sad that we couldn't do it for longer, but if I put solar panels on that probe, it was too expensive, or it was too heavy, just because solar panel technology is a little bit early for me still. I think on the next orbiter attempt, the next major orbiter difference, it's going to be it's going to have solar panels. I'm going to maybe put like a Ranger solar panel on it or something, since we will have it researched by then. But we do have a couple things planned for the next year. We have quite a few things planned, actually. So we're going to attempt, I believe, to launch one more mission to the moon. We're going to also launch a mission, I believe, with film on board. We're going to try and do a more advanced planetary photography mission. We are falling very far behind the Soviet Union at this point, and I am a little bit upset about that. By this point, the Soviet Union is already sending probes to foreign bodies, other planets, and we are left in the dust, really. Our program is starting to really fall apart when it comes to that. I suppose it can't be helped. This is my first time playing RP-1 this far into the series. I've never made it past light satellites before this series, and I'm trying to do my best. I've definitely worked out and made the early game much more efficient, but and much more plentiful. I get a lot more done in the early game than I used to, but now I'm struggling to keep up with the rapid advancements that need to be done. Really, when you're playing RP-1, you need to be planning over a year in advance for most things. You need to be planning what you're going to do the year after the next year. Each year you need to be thinking about. And that's something that I didn't really do going into it. Obviously, you can see we literally just finished the early communications satellites program. Just, I don't want to miss this here, but Gwen seems to have nearly encountered her death. And I think next year we're going to give her a little bit of a break from flying after this horrifying flight. But she made it out safely, thankfully, because she's going to be our first astronaut in orbit. But I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and leave a like, go ahead, comment, or subscribe, and I'll see you next year when we get quite a bit more done, hopefully. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.